The notification arrived on a Tuesday morning. Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, was going through security reports in his simple office in Ouagadougou when his foreign minister entered without knocking. His expression, urgent, even before he spoke. "Mr. President, we've just received formal communication from the United Nations. Your speaking slot at next week's General Assembly has been revoked." Traoré looked up from his papers, his face calm and unreadable. At 35, the former geology student turned army captain had already weathered several coup attempts and was leading a nation grappling with violent insurgencies. A diplomatic snub wasn't enough to shake his resolve. "On what basis?" he asked, setting his pen down on the polished wooden desk, one of the few signs of comfort in the otherwise bare presidential office. "Officially, procedural irregularities," the minister replied. "But our contacts inside the UN say there's more to it. What first appeared to be an administrative issue would soon be revealed as something far more serious. It marked a turning point in African diplomacy and a direct challenge to long-standing post-colonial influence." Word spread quickly across Burkina Faso's capital. In markets and cafes, people discussed what many viewed as a blatant insult to their country's sovereignty. Outside the presidential compound, a crowd began to gather, spontaneously breaking into patriotic songs and chants of loyalty to their young president. But the real story, how this apparent insult would be turned into a moment of strength, was just beginning inside the palace. Traoré was about to make a decision that would echo well beyond the borders of his landlocked West African country. The UN's rejection would become the very stage from which Ibrahim Traoré would deliver one of the most powerful messages Africa had sent the world in decades. What followed would disrupt global diplomacy and shift how African nations saw their role on the world stage. By the next morning, an emergency cabinet meeting had been called in the presidential palace's Situation Room. The mood was heavy as ministers and advisors took their seats, worry clear on their faces. Overnight, intelligence updates had shed light on the real reasons behind the UN's move. Our sources confirmed that 3 permanent members of the Security Council applied pressure on the Secretary General's office to have you removed from the speakers list, said the foreign minister as he displayed sensitive diplomatic documents on the screen. The evidence was clear. Behind-the-scenes meetings had taken place in New York, Paris, and London, specifically aimed at blocking Traoré's upcoming speech. The leaked transcripts exposed the true concerns. Burkina Faso's recent shift away from Western influence, the cancelling of unfair mining deals, and most importantly, Traoré's planned announcement of a new Pan-African economic alliance, one that would reduce foreign control over African resources. "They're afraid of your message, not your country's size," said Colonel Kabor, Traoré's longtime friend and trusted military advisor. "Your speech would have struck a chord with many African leaders exploring the same path." Surveillance reports confirmed it. Western diplomats had recently begun referring to Traoré as the new Sankara, drawing parallels between him and Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader who was assassinated in 1987 after challenging neo-colonial economic systems. The room fell quiet as images flashed on the screen. Footage of diplomatic vehicles entering a private estate near Geneva 3 days earlier. Just hours before the United Nations made its announcement, representatives from large multinational corporations involved in West Africa's mining industry had met with Western diplomats. "This is about our new mining regulations?" Traoré asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Partly," replied the Minister of Mines. "Since we mandated that 55% of mining profits remain in Burkina Faso, we've received numerous threats. These companies stand to lose billions in future earnings." As troubling as that was, the second piece of intelligence revealed the broader implications. Satellite images showed increased military activity at Western bases in neighboring countries, along with signs of expanded surveillance operations targeting Burkina Faso's government communications. "They're not just trying to silence your speech, Mr. President," said the defense minister gravely. "They're preparing alternative plans." Angry murmurs filled the room. Some ministers called for a public denunciation, while others proposed retaliatory diplomatic responses. Traoré remained silent, studying the information before him. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but firm. "If one speech at the UN made them nervous," he said, "then we should give them a real reason to be concerned." He rose and walked over to the map of Africa mounted on the wall. "Contact our allies in Mali, Niger, and Guinea. Also reach out to South Africa and Kenya. It's time to initiate Plan Continental." His ministers exchanged knowing looks, aware of the strategy they had been crafting, one that could reshape Africa's role in global affairs. "They've shut one door," Traoré continued, his finger tracing routes across the continent. "We'll open 54 more." As the meeting ended, Traoré remained alone in the Situation Room, his eyes fixed on the map of Africa, a continent carved up by colonial powers a century ago, but now facing the opportunity to unite in the face of a shared threat. What's your perspective on these developments? Was the ban truly a procedural move, as claimed, or a calculated effort to silence a rising advocate for African self-determination? Share your thoughts in the comments below. That evening, while global news outlets continued to describe the UN's decision as a routine matter, Ibrahim Traoré retreated to his private quarters in a quiet section of the presidential compound. Unlike his predecessors, who had lived in lavish residences, Traoré had chosen a modest 3-room apartment within the palace's working area, an expression of his commitment to revolutionary ideals. His room was sparsely furnished, containing only a few personal belongings: books on African history and economic policy, a photograph of Thomas Sankara, and a small wooden carving from his mother. From a drawer, he retrieved an old, worn notebook, a keepsake from his university days, its pages filled with hopes and plans for his country's future still fresh in his mind. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Musa, his oldest friend from their village days, now acting as his trusted advisor and one of the few granted access to the president during private moments. "The secure lines are ready," Musa reported. "Leaders from 23 African nations are on standby for your call. More will join by morning." Traoré nodded, placing his notebook aside. "Our media plan?" he asked. "We've secured independent broadcasters across the continent," Musa said. "Social media teams are set. Once you give the word, we'll reach far more people than any UN platform ever could." For the first time that day, Traoré smiled. "They're still thinking in outdated ways, Musa. They shut down one microphone, not realizing we now have millions." Two men stepped into a nearby secure communications room, where a team of tech experts had established encrypted links to presidential offices across Africa. Over the next 4 hours, Traoré held fast-paced talks with fellow leaders. Some were long-standing allies, others historical rivals, but all now united by a clear understanding of what this diplomatic confrontation really meant. President Adama of Ghana was the first to speak. "This isn't only about Burkina Faso, Ibrahim, it's about whether any of us can truly speak for ourselves." President Nyong'o of Kenya added, "My intelligence picked up messages about this 3 days ago. Your speech was flagged because of your comments on economic independence. They fear others might adopt your model for resource control." As dawn neared, agreement took shape among the African heads of state. What had started as an effort to mute a single voice was becoming a collective message too strong to ignore. By morning, 38 African nations had pledged to a unified response that would challenge the status quo in international relations. While those high-level talks were underway in Ouagadougou, ordinary people were taking action on their own. University students hosted public readings of Traoré's past speeches. Market women gathered signatures on petitions backing the president. Taxi drivers handed out leaflets explaining the new mining rules that had unsettled foreign interests. At the Central Hospital, Dr. Fatima Dio, who had known Traoré since their university years, addressed her medical team. "This is what happens when we take charge of our own resources to fund our own healthcare. They will try to silence us, but we must keep going." By daybreak, reports reached the presidential palace. Similar grassroots efforts were rising across West Africa, a wave of unity that crossed borders. As sunlight broke, Traoré stepped out of the secure room, tired but determined. To his gathered staff, he declared, "Today we launch Plan Continental. What they meant as our silencing will become Africa's strongest voice in decades." Within hours, a synchronized announcement was issued across the continent. In multiple African capitals, the message was unmistakable. If one African leader could be silenced on procedural grounds, then the entire framework needed to be re-evaluated. A statement was issued announcing an emergency Pan-African summit to be held in Ouagadougou in just 5 days, a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the upcoming UN General Assembly scheduled that same week. Thank you for staying with us up to this point. Your continued support means a lot, and I assure you, the most impactful part of this remarkable story is still ahead. The announcement of the Pan-African Summit quickly gained traction across international news outlets. What had initially appeared to be a minor diplomatic issue was fast becoming a significant test of the global order. Western governments rushed to respond, but found themselves caught off guard by the speed and unity of the African-led initiative. In the days that followed, Ouagadougou underwent a rapid transformation. Despite Burkina Faso's limited means, the city rose to the occasion in an extraordinary way. Residents offered their homes to host attendees, university students acted as interpreters, and local businesses stepped up to provide meals and transportation. Ibrahim Traoré worked relentlessly, sleeping only a few hours each night. His days were packed with diplomatic engagements, security meetings, and summit logistics, while his nights were spent drafting and refining a speech that now had the potential to reach a much wider audience than the UN General Assembly ever could. By the third day of preparation, an unexpected shift took place. Delegates began arriving not only from African countries, but also from across the global south. Representatives from Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands requested observer status at the summit. What started as an African initiative was quickly becoming a broader alliance of nations often sidelined in global affairs. This growing involvement raised alarms in Western foreign ministries. Confidential diplomatic cables revealed increasing anxiety that the Ouagadougou summit might draw attention away from the UN General Assembly. Emergency meetings in Washington, London, and Paris were convened to devise ways to reduce the summit's influence. "They're trying to split us apart now," Traoré told his cabinet, pointing to intelligence reports showing that several African nations were being offered more aid in exchange for pulling out of the summit. "Some of our partners have faced both incentives and threats in the last day alone." Yet instead of weakening the movement, these tactics only deepened determination across the continent. When Mali's delegation was temporarily held at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport during a layover, 6 other African countries responded by recalling their ambassadors from France in protest. As the summit neared, Traoré received a confidential message from an unexpected source, a mid-level UN staffer with inside knowledge of the meeting where his UN speech slot had been revoked. "Mr. President, I'm taking a big risk by sharing this, but the truth needs to come out. You were removed from the speakers list after direct threats were made to cut funding for UN programs. The reason given was that your upcoming announcement about creating a new African monetary fund could disrupt financial stability in the region. I've attached the full recording of the meeting. Do with it as you see fit." This final piece of evidence confirmed what Traoré had long suspected. His speech had been viewed as a serious challenge to the financial systems that had maintained Africa's economic dependency for decades. On the eve of the summit, Ouagadougou was alive with anticipation, unlike anything seen before in the city's history. 47 African nations had confirmed their participation. 42 were sending their heads of state, and the remaining 5 were represented by senior ministers. In addition, 26 countries from the global south had dispatched observer delegations. That evening, in a rare moment of quiet introspection, Traoré stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, gazing out at the brightly lit city. Moussa joined him, carrying 2 cups of traditional green tea. "Are you feeling nervous?" Moussa asked, handing a cup to his friend. "Not nervous," Traoré replied, "but very aware of what tomorrow represents. This isn't just about a cancelled speech. It's about whether we can truly choose a new direction." Musa nodded, his eyes scanning the city where international flags now lined the main roads. "They tried to silence one voice," he said, "but ended up awakening many." As the two men shared this quiet exchange, emergency meetings were underway across several Western capitals. The scale and meaning of the Ouagadougou summit had finally become clear, but the reaction came too late. The movement had already taken on a life of its own. The next morning was clear and sunny. Burkina Faso's national stadium, quickly repurposed as a conference center, was packed with delegates, media personnel, and international observers. The world's focus had shifted from the usual diplomatic hubs to an unexpected new stage in East Africa. The opening ceremony of the Ouagadougou summit made a strong visual impression. Rather than a traditional layout that prioritized major powers, the African leaders seated themselves in a perfect circle, an intentional symbol of equal standing among nations, no matter their size or economic strength. As host, Ibrahim Traoré took his place among them, not at the front, but as part of the circle. The significance of this symbolic arrangement was not lost on the international audience. This was more than just a conference. It was a fresh vision of how nations could relate to one another. Instead of being opened by political figures, the summit began with cultural ambassadors, traditional storytellers from across the continent who shared accounts of pre-colonial African unity and independence. This return to historical self-governance set a meaningful tone for the discussions that would follow. When Traoré finally stepped up to speak, the very address previously labeled too provocative for the UN, the crowd grew still with anticipation. Major global news outlets, which had initially planned to provide limited coverage, switched to live broadcasts, reaching viewers around the world. Distinguished leaders, brothers and sisters of Africa and the global South, Traoré began, his voice steady and clear. "We gather here today not because of the danger of one speech, but because of the future it dares to imagine." Without dramatics, he systematically laid out proof of an organized effort to block his UN address, including a recording provided by a whistleblower. The revelation sent ripples through the audience and the international press. "But this summit is not about one speech or one silenced voice," he went on. "It's about identifying a long-standing pattern, one that began when our nations gained symbolic independence." He argued that political freedom without true control over economic resources amounts to little more than a mirage. What followed was a powerful economic critique. Traoré outlined how global financial systems, unfair loan practices, and exploitative resource deals had repeatedly hindered African growth. He cited evidence that countries attempting to pursue their own economic paths were often met with consistent external interference. Then came the proposal that had sparked deep concern among financial elites: the creation of an African monetary fund and a resource sovereignty alliance. This initiative would establish shared financial reserves to guard against economic coercion, coordinate resource contracts to prevent exploitation, and launch an alternative development bank powered by African capital. "For too long, we have been turned against one another," Traoré stated. "When we negotiate alone, we are vulnerable. But united, no one can impose terms on us." As he reached the end of his speech, Traoré set aside his prepared remarks and spoke from the heart. "I stand here not as a revolutionary or a visionary, but as an African who believes that the riches beneath our land should serve the children who walk on it. This is not extreme. This is simple justice." The reaction was overwhelming. Leaders across the assembly rose to their feet. A standing ovation lasting nearly 5 minutes set the tone. What unfolded next was described by global observers as the most pivotal diplomatic shift since the non-aligned movement of the 1960s. Over the following 3 days, African nations acted with extraordinary unity. 43 countries signed the founding charter of the African Monetary Fund. 38 committed to a shared framework for negotiating natural resources. Most notably, a unified African stance on UN Security Council reform was adopted, calling for permanent African representation with veto authority. The international response was immediate and mixed. Financial markets showed early volatility as investors grasped the potential impact on resource-dependent industries. Western governments expressed concern over regional stability, while also dispatching envoys to Ouagadougou, acknowledging the changing landscape. However, the most powerful reaction came from Africans themselves. Across the continent, public enthusiasm soared. In nations like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, large demonstrations voiced support for what became known as the Ouagadougou Declaration. Social media amplified this momentum with hashtags such as Your Africa Rising and Amiwaga Spirit trending worldwide. On the summit's final day, a communiqué was released directed at the United Nations. Rather than focusing on the previous speaking slot controversy, it simply declared, "The nations of Africa look forward to participating in a reformed global order that respects the equal sovereignty of all peoples. Until such changes are realized, we will move forward in building our own systems of cooperation and security." As the summit drew to a close, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the airport, seeing off departing delegates. The president of Ethiopia embraced him warmly. "They tried to silence you in New York," she said, "but instead, your voice resonated across every corner of our continent." Traoré offered a thoughtful smile. "The voice was never mine alone," he replied. "It has always belonged to all of us." In the following weeks, implementation of the Ouagadougou initiatives began in earnest. Technical committees were formed, headquarters sites were chosen, and the first rounds of funding were allocated. Western efforts to disrupt the process through targeted pressure on vulnerable nations met with limited success. The strength of a united front had fostered a new kind of resilience. 6 weeks after the summit, in a move few had foreseen, the UN Secretary-General paid an unannounced visit to Ouagadougou. While officially framed as a standard diplomatic mission, sources close to the matter indicated that the real agenda was to explore how African-led initiatives could be incorporated into the broader international system, a quiet recognition of their growing relevance and strength. Ibrahim Traoré welcomed his guest in the same unassuming office where, just weeks before, he had received news that his speaking slot had been cancelled. The moment was not lost on either of them. "Sometimes," Traoré remarked as they took their seats, "what seems like a closed door is really just the start of a new path." What's your take on Ibrahim Traoré's diplomatic strategy? Was the Ouagadougou summit a calculated strategic success, or merely a short-lived symbolic gesture? And how might this rising Pan-African solidarity reshape global power dynamics? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you appreciated this inside view of Africa's evolving leadership, be sure to subscribe for more content on the continent's growing global role, and don't miss our next video. They tried to arrest him at the airport, but Ibrahim Traoré's composed reaction left everyone stunned.